There we go.
There we go.
Just waiting, there we go. Just waiting for the technology to kick in there. So thank you everybody for joining this webinar today. We're talking all about integrating risk and with ISO standards. Delighted to say I'm joined. You aren't going to have to listen to my voice for an hour, but I've also been joined by a couple of people who know an awful lot more about risk and ISO than I do, Ian McKinney and Tim Pennell. And for some reason, the screen is not updating. So let's just stop that and start again, shall we? There we go. Worked eventually. Right, so a little bit about RRSM before we go any further. And Holly, I'm going to hand back to you and just say, would you like to explain a little bit who RRSM are and what do you do?
Sure, yep. So RRSM is a membership body with a presence in over 95 countries. Our members work in all areas of risk at every level and are united around a desire to use risk management to improve decision making and also organisational resilience. And to support that aim, we provide training, resources and knowledge sharing opportunities to help our individual members and their organisations also.
Fantastic, thank you for that. So it's a really busy organisation, and I encourage anybody who's not a RRSM member to actually have a look at the website. There's an awful lot going on, lots of training courses, lots of webinars. You've mentioned, Holly, there's the RRSM YouTube channel, there's the LinkedIn, but there's a whole plethora of information going on, isn't it? You don't need to be a risk management geek to get benefit from it. So today, I'll introduce shortly Tim and Ian to you, and then we're going to have a little bit of a look at who is ISO and what the ISO organisation actually deliver. We'll look at some of the benefits of adopting an ISO certification, and typically ISO certifications come with a little bit of a cost associated with them. So we'll talk a little bit around some of that cost benefits analysis that you can do. We've got a number of questions that we can give to the panel. Say Ian and Tim are experts in their field, so please ask questions as we go through, and hopefully we'll make this a really interesting session for you. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Tim, just to ask Tim to give a bit of an introduction to you on who he is, what he does. And I think, Tim, it would be useful as well to explain who NQA are as well and what they deliver for organisations.
Thanks, Helen. Hi, folks. Yeah, let's start with NQA. NQA is a global certification body. By that, I mean that we have auditors across the globe who go in and audit organisations against the ISO standards, that is the international standards. And typically that ranges from quality, which many of you are familiar with, which is ISO 9001. Then we have environmental management, energy management, health and safety, information security, privacy, business continuity, IT operations and so on, but also very heavily in the aerospace and automotive industries as well. They have their own set of specific standards. My role particularly is to head up the information assurance business unit. So as well as being an auditor in information standards, that is ISO 27001 information security, 27701 which is privacy, 22301 which is business continuity and associated standards, as well as quality. I also act as NQA's internal information assurance technical expert as well. So I advise and ensure my fellow auditors maintain a level of information security, knowledge and awareness, but also ensuring that all auditing standards are maintained as well. What that means is, as well as my own exposure to organisations, I also talk very much with my colleagues and understand how they've been working with their clients as well. And we get a very good picture from SMEs all the way up to big blue chip companies on how risk is managed, particularly within the ISO framework, which Helen is going to talk about in a minute. That'll do for me. Shall I hand over to Ian now?
Okay, Ian.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Ian McKinney. I have a misleading accent in that I sound like I'm from Northern Ireland. I am from Northern Ireland, but I currently live in the Midlands in England, and I'm based in the Coventry office of Gallagher. Gallagher is a multinational insurance broker, and within Gallagher, I wear a number of hats. So one hat is that I look after some clients and I organise their insurance programs. Another hat is that I look after a team of people who look after clients and organise their insurance programs. And a final hat is that I sit on an internal special interest group on cyber within Gallagher, which looks at both risk and insurance aspects of cyber, and cyber risk and data risk more widely. I've been at insurance for longer than I care to tell you, and my beard is temporary for lockdown.
That's brilliant, thank you, Ian and Tim. And then just to finish off as well, my name is Helen Barge, as Holly's already mentioned. I'm the Managing Director at Risk Evolves, which is a consultancy company based here in the West Midlands. I'm also a fellow as well of the International Institute of the Risk and Safety Managers. What does Risk Evolves do? Well, we are a consultancy company that helps clients navigate and understand their risk. And as Tim's already alluded to as well, we ourselves have a number of international standards. So Risk Evolves has achieved ISO 9001, ISO 27001, 27701, and we're also really big advocates as well of the Cyber Essentials scheme, which, whilst it's a UK scheme, is something that I firmly believe every organisation, regardless of where you are in the world, should adhere and adopt. As Tim said, Tim and I work quite closely together on a number of projects, and we are both, I think, it's fair to say, Tim, isn't it? We're both quite geeky when it comes to things like data privacy and information security, and why just having some of the basic controls in place can make a huge difference, such that you don't necessarily need to pick up the phone to Ian and go, I've got a problem. So enough about us. Let's talk a little bit about ISO. So who is ISO and what do they do? So many of you may be familiar with ISO standards, and Tim's already mentioned a number of them. It did sound like a really badly represented bingo card in terms of ISO 9001 and 27001. There's a huge number of standards out there, and there's a little bit of the research I did before doing this presentation, bringing this presentation together. I actually researched how many ISO standards there are in the globe, and believe it or not, there are over 24,000 different ISO standards that ISO themselves look after. They are represented across 167 different countries, which means, and our representative organisation here in the UK is BSI. And what do? They design and agree international specifications, and on their own website, ISO broadly describe it as identifying what's the best way of doing this. So if you're going to do something for the first time, and perhaps that will be information security or environmental management, you would be well advised to pick up one of the standards, because those standards are built on international experts coming together and going, okay, how can we put together a standard, a framework to help organisations manage their risk and achieve intended outcomes properly. As it says there, they also oversee regular reviews, so any of the standards that have been developed, and the ISO organisation itself has actually been in existence since 1946, so they've developed a lot of standards over the years. Those standards aren't left to gather dust, they are regularly reviewed. So if you look, for example, at the 9001 standard, that was last reviewed formally in 2015. It also had a lighter touch review last year. If we look at, I think, Tim, correct me on this, 27001, 27002 is currently undergoing review. Am I right on that, or I've got that wrong?
That's right. 27002 is due to be published this year, and then 27001 we're hearing will have an emergency change to align with 27002.
Right, so you heard it here, guys. And the importance of doing that is it reflects what's going on in the countries. It reflects what organisations are asking and seeing in terms of how they continue to improve and meet the requirements of various stakeholders. So ISO standards are not something that sit, as we say, in stone. They are something that continue to evolve and to meet demand and improve risks for various organisations. Now, I also went to the website as well, and I thought, okay, so what are the most popular standards across the globe? And the table there is actually from ISO. It's based on the 2020 survey that they do. So ISO review the standards, these top 12 standards, on an annual basis. That survey is completed in September of each year. So we're expecting the feedback for 2021 to be represented in 2022, in September 2022. But there were a few numbers that stood out for me, and even as somebody who's quite close to the standards, there were a few surprises in the numbers that were reported for 2021. So I don't think it's a great surprise, Tim, to see that 9001 is there as the big standard across so many sites. And I guess this is what you see as well at NQA in terms of customers coming to you.
Indeed, 9001 is the one that's been around long enough. I've certainly been around long enough, since the early days of TQM, when it was a BSI standard. Yeah, it is the #1 standard with the greatest penetration, and yeah, our figures broadly represent what you see there in our experience in the market at the moment.
And as you can see there as well, the numbers say that in 2020 that the organisation saw an 18% increase in the total number of valid certificates. Now, certainly as we're an organisation at Risk Evolves who works with a number of smaller companies, what we've seen is a significant step up, a significant increase in demand for SMEs to achieve standards. And that's driven a lot through the supply chain. We'll come on to that a little bit later. There's been, as Tim said there, a 4% increase for ISO 9001. Not a surprise. If you get stuck with any standard or if you don't know where to start, I would always recommend that 9001 is the standard to start with. It is, if you like, the entry point standard, and it covers not just products, but it also covers services when we're looking at quality management within businesses. 14001, ISO reported that there had been a significant uptick in the number of standards due to some changes in China, some demand in China. But again, if you think COP26, if you think about where we are from an environmental perspective, it's not a surprise that the environmental standard is gaining more traction across the globe. I think the number that did surprise me when I looked at this, and Tim, I'll be very honest and say I took it straight from the NQA website. I'd seen, and we've seen at Risk Evolves, a significant increase in the demand for 27001 standards. I really hadn't appreciated it was a 24.7% increase in certificates across the globe. And I guess, Tim and Ian, what are your thoughts on that number? Because I'd say it was a surprise to me. Or am I just out of touch? I don't know, be kind.
No, you've got your finger on the pulse, Helen, and certainly those are the 2020 figures. And what we've seen during lockdown, there's been a really increased focus on information security with the prevalence of home working or remote working and emptied offices and increased use of cloud-based services as well. So many organizations recognizing that they are processing so much information out of the corporate environment, if you like, and are looking for that security framework, which 27001 provides. So it'll be interesting to see the 2021 numbers when we have them, but I would expect that trajectory to continue, if not be better.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that. What we've seen in our experience in the insurance world is that increase in the certifications on 27001 is matched probably by the number of people who've sought cyber insurance for the first time. So we've probably seen 25–50% increase in clients who haven't purchased cyber or data cover who are now buying it, and as Tim says, that's driven by the circumstances in which many businesses and people have found themselves.
And I think, Ian, we're going to cover that, the difference, if you like, the change in the insurance industry and the focus on cyber and information security. I've got a number of questions, and I'm sure the audience has got a number of questions around how the insurance market has possibly changed some of its policies and so on, and whether that's just a UK phenomenon or whether we're seeing it elsewhere. So hold those thoughts. I'm seeing lots of questions going to come through on that one. So the key message here is that ISO is not going away. In actual fact, what we're seeing, and you've just heard there from my colleagues on the panel, is that we're seeing ISO standards, regardless of sector, regardless of size of organisation, being driven across supply chains, and actually it becoming more relevant to organisations as we grow and adapt. But where does risk management sit with this as well? So risk management and ISO absolutely come together. Clearly, as risk management professionals, we'll be aware of ISO 31000, which is around risk management. But most of the standards have adopted something called Annex SL. And Annex SL has been absolutely brilliant when we look at standards, especially, I have to say, for smaller businesses, because it allows the standards to interlock, interface and plug together a lot better than they had previously done. Clause 6, the techies, the geeks among us, Clause 6 is the clause which focuses a huge amount on risk. It's very much in the planning phase. So if we look at quality, what actions, what items could occur that could prevent you from delivering to your client, for example. And Plan, Do, Check, Act, if you've never come across it before, is very much is the Deming, aligned to William Deming, a model that he put together. And when I talk to clients, I talk to them it's a very simple mechanism of thinking. You plan what you're going to do. You do what you plan to do. You check that you did what you planned to do, and you act accordingly if you find there's been any non-conformities or any issues with what you plan to do. And by reiterating that process, we continue to see improvement across an organisation. And as an organisation, as I say, that's got 3 standards myself, taking that philosophy and implementing it, we are absolutely seeing benefits associated with that Plan, Do, Check, Act model. Now, Tim, you're an auditor, putting you on the point here. What do you look for when you audit companies for clause 6?
Well, the thing is with clause 6, as you've described, it occurs within that plan, do, check, act cycle. So each time you're performing some form of risk assessment, you're doing it in that iterative cycle. So you've done the risks, you've implemented controls, reviewed the performance of those controls, and then gone back and risk assessed them again. And it's that virtuous circle that makes things better. But it always starts at the top. One of the fundamental requirements of Annex SL is that top leadership set the direction, the commitment to continual improvement. And part of that is that these Annex SL standards are risk-based. So when it comes to clause 6, then I'm looking at top management have made that commitment, and then the organization have prepared, considered the context of their organization. What are the issues, the influences, the inputs and outputs of their organization, and therefore what could go wrong? Now, it's not just risk, it's also opportunities as well. It's both sides of a coin. So that's the beauty of Annex SL. It's asking an organization to look at the risks and to look at the opportunities presented by operating the management system. The different standards go into risk in different levels. In 9001 quality, it's simply looking at the risks and opportunities to operating the management system and how they benefit or could detract from the organization. Whereas 27001 is information security, and it has a very detailed set of requirements for performing a risk assessment. And these are mandatory requirements. So as an auditor, I was looking to see that it's had all of that thought put into it, and the outcomes are relevant to the organization. We don't want anything wild or black swan type stuff.
Brilliant, brilliant. And we've included a link there as well to a great document that NQA produced. And I think, Tim, actually you produced this, didn't you, for NQA? I have to say it is my go-to document when I'm working with clients on integrating standards. It just aligns all the Annex SL requirements and maps it across the various standards. So that's there for you as a reference point in the future. So we talked an awful lot about what the standards are. Let's talk a little bit about the benefits. So I see ISO as being really fundamental when it comes to evidencing and supporting good governance, good risk and good compliance management. For me, it goes without saying that is really important. And we've actually got another webinar on good governance in organisations later in the month. For stakeholders as well, it gives confidence. So we're seeing a huge increase in ISO certifications as being a requirement before you can enter into a supply chain. We're just completing at the moment, one of my colleagues is working with a client who's got a number of standards, and he is unequivocal in that unless he had those standards, he would not even have been able to gain entry into a particular piece of supply chain. And it gives reassurance to those individuals as well that that you are delivering good standards. I think the importance of an independent external auditor is sometimes underrated, isn't it, Tim? I see your eyes when you come and work with us on client pieces of work, having a second view, a second set of opinions as being invaluable to how management systems are being run.
Indeed, an auditor will turn up and won't be familiar with an organisation, will be familiar with the market or the sector within which it's working, but we tend to only see a client once a year as part of that certification cycle. And so we're providing that fresh set of eyes, albeit within the auditing framework. And that's the beauty, again, of the management system standards. You've got your internal audits and you've got your external audits as well. And together, it feeds and fosters that continual improvement cycle. I think it's worth mentioning as well, sometimes we come in to see clients, and there are a few clients who just want the tick in the box. By and large, and what is really refreshing and encouraging, is that so many organizations want to be better. And when they're better, they know they can evidence that to their customers when they're joining the supply chain. And those organizations that embrace it get the most out of it without a shadow of a doubt.
Absolutely, and that can, and you know, on the slide there, we've got this commitment to continual improvement. I see that as a fundamental deliverable, if you like, of the ISO standards. But actually, every business wants to improve, whether it's around looking at processes, whether it's about reducing costs, whether it's about entering new marketplaces. That I see as being the upside of managing risk effectively within a business. Cost reductions. Now, I frequently get asked, ISOs cost so much money. Are you going to see an equivalent cost reduction in it, Tim? How do you counter some of those challenges?
if I put a purely security hat on, and I think back to the amount of business cases that I know failed because they failed to articulate a requirement correctly, I start talking about cost of security failure. The argument being there, certainly in information security, that if you are operating your security controls in a continuous improvement framework, then you are reducing the likelihood of something going wrong. Unfortunately, that can be a bit intangible because many organizations will say, well, nothing has gone wrong. You can't argue with that, except point to evidence out there, phishing attacks, ransomware, and so on and so forth, saying actually it does, and it's a lot more regular than many organizations believe. So certainly there are cost reductions and there are side effects, or sorry, they are a consequence of no cost of security failure.
Absolutely. And Ian, I'm going to bring you in on this one as well, because from an insurance perspective, you're seeing ISO through a different lens, I think, perhaps to the ones that Tim and I see. What's the viewpoint of the insurance industry at the moment when it comes to ISO certifications?
Yeah, it's interesting because I am very much on the other side of that equation, and I would say in the insurance world, I guess if I could correct a common misconception at the outset, which is I'm an insurance broker, and people will often think that I sell insurance to businesses and so on. It's actually completely the other way around. My job is effectively to sell those businesses to insurance companies and convince the insurance company that this is a viable option and a valid business to insure. And if the way that I would often think about things like ISO standards and certifications and whether people are whether businesses meet certain standards or do certain things, those are the features that will enable me and assist me as an insurance broker to sell that risk or that client to the insurance company and get a better deal. And just to pick up, Tim's exactly, I would absolutely echo what Tim said about the total cost. And this is something we talk about in insurance a lot, about the total cost of risk. And very often a lot of that, like the proverbial iceberg, people don't see the cost of failure and they don't see the cost of errors. In my own experience, and this is purely anecdotal, I have no facts and figures whatsoever to back this up, but in my own experience, those companies and clients that I've dealt with in my insurance career who've had certifications and standards, who've had 9001, 14001, 45001, and more recently 27001, or some combination thereof, those businesses and clients that I've had ISO certification almost almost to a business, have been better run, have seen fewer claims, or make more money, and I think there's probably a correlation there. Certainly there is in my experience.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I'm sure again that's a point we're going to come back to as we go through the rest of the session. So I want to open the. We haven't had any questions come through as we've been talking. Holly, have you got any questions coming from the audience? If not, I'll start firing some across to Tim and to Ian.
Yes, we have had a couple of questions come through. So first is from Jason, and he has asked, have the county councils embraced ISO driven by insurance requirements?
Tim, do you work with any county councils from an ISO perspective?
We do, but whether or not they've been driven by insurance requirements, I can't answer that. But certainly there are councils that are certified to ISO 9001, also NHS trusts as well, and I've seen them flowing that requirement down their supply chain as well.
And from a consultancy perspective, when we work with clients who are into public sector, and that's not just county councils, that's right the way across the piece, there will be, certainly for some of them, a minimum entry of having at least 9001, and we're seeing increasingly cyber essentials, and also 27001. Ian, what do you see from an insurance perspective?
Yeah, so I'm Gallagher, not me. So Jason, please don't complain to me. It's a different person at Gallagher. But Gallagher we insure quite a few public authorities. We've got a specialist team that do that. And I know because I've had dealings with that team. It's not that necessarily that that insurers will. It's not necessarily that all insurers will insist on having the standard. It's that for some insurers that will be reflective of good management, and it will be a filter. So if you imagine there are 5 insurers available to us, we might rule out 2 of them for a council or indeed any other business that doesn't have say if it's cyber, it might be 27,001, or if it's liability policy or employer's liability, it might be 45,001 or whatever. So some insurers, you wouldn't rule them out completely, but there might be a feature that they look for. And I would suggest that probably, certainly in the public authorities world, those markets are so limited. There's so few insurers that will write that particular business, and it's a very specialist market, that they can probably pick and choose, and they're in the position of saying, yes, we'd like X customer to have, or X council to have this. And that would probably be even more so where you might, if you had a poor claims record, for example, they might insist that something is done about that, and the something that is done about that might be get the certification, because by getting the certification, we know as your insurer that you will have had to have made certain changes, and you will have to, I can't remember how it was worded, but do it the best way that it should be done, as ISO themselves say it.
And Ian, in that instance, do you know whether they're asking for a full scope certification? So i.e., and when we talk to scope, Tim and I talk a lot about scope when we get into certifications, is it the scope of the whole company or just part of the organisation? And similarly, are we looking for a Ucas, if it's a UK company, a Ucas audited certification or a non-Ucas? And I'll let Tim explain what the difference is between Ucas and non-Ucas.
Yeah, so I don't know enough about the councils to know whether they, but I suspect, if I had to guess, that that insurers would probably look at that as a single entity, albeit that they have different functions and so on. But I do know that, again, I have a number of clients who have different subsidiaries who do different things, and in some cases, we might have a client who has, for example, might have a 14,001 for a business of theirs that's exposed somehow in the environmental, but then on the other side of the business, there's no exposure there, and it's not an issue for them. And in that case, they might have it for part of the business and not for another part, and that's generally not a problem as long as there's a reason for it. As long as, and again, it comes back to us having to sell that business and explain it to the insurance company. On the public authorities or councils, I feel I have to pass, but I suspect they would probably look at them as one entity.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Tim. It can be a little bit emotive, can't it? Value of a Ucas certification versus a non-Ucas certification. Can you just explain for the audience who Ucas are? I'm going to ask you whether there's an equivalent of Ucas in the countries outside of the UK, and what's their role and what's their value, please.
Sure, okay. So NQA are a certification body in that we go in, audit organisations against an ISO standard and issue a certificate. But who audits NQA to make sure that NQA's auditors are meeting the auditing standard? We audit management systems in accordance with ISO 17021. So someone has to check NQA. Ucas is the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, and they are the body solely responsible in the UK for what's known as accrediting UK certification bodies to issue certificates. Ucas has an equivalent in pretty much every other country. So in America, there is ANAB, and that is the American equivalent. And all of these accreditation bodies are member of an international forum, which essentially sets that overall standard for the accreditation services, if you like. And what that means then is that any certificate issued in one country is equally valid in any other country, issued whereby those certificates are issued by a different accreditation body. So certificates, ISO certificates issued by an accredited certification body are equivalent around the world. Ucas is seen as a sort of a thought leader, if you like, or a leader in that area, in the accreditation area, but nonetheless, that shouldn't make any difference. They should be equivalent. Many organizations nonetheless do prefer to have a Ucas accredited certificate. It certainly carries, I'm not sure what the word is, it has a good reputation, let's put it like that. It's highly thought of.
Yeah, definitely, we see the same. How are we doing with questions, Holly?
And we've got a couple of more. So the next one is, and this is from Simon, and he starts by saying thank you for the engaging webinar. He then asks, my question is, if we standardise the requirements for innovation with ISO 56000, are we not in fact going to stifle innovation? So isn't it really tautological to have a standard such as this?
Wow. Tim, I can see Tim. What's 56,000, Tim? That's a standard
Yeah,
that I'm not familiar with. So that's over to you, I'm afraid.
Innovation. I'm just here on my Google is my friend. Innovation management. Well, that's a great one. So I need to check. I'm not even sure that's a management system standard. In fact, it's not. It's fundamentals and vocabulary. I mean, there might be a 56,001. It's important to draw the distinction between management system standards and guidance, if you like. So management system standard is something to which you can be audited and have a certificate issued. So you can say you are certified to 9001. There are many other associated standards or ancillary standards that support that standard. Some simply provide vocabulary and definitions. Some provide guidance. You can't be audited against guidance. Well, you can, but we can't issue a certificate as such. So I'd need to look into 56,000 a bit more and come back to you on that. I'm wondering if there's a 56,001 and so on and so forth. I was wondering if we could make a note of, was it Simon who asked the question? And I'll be very happy to get back to him. If you could pass me his details, then I will look into it and I'll reply offline.
Okay,
just we can download these slides, can't we, Holly? So all the slides are available, and actually in the back of the pack, I've included as well the contact details for myself, Ian, and Tim as well, if anybody wants to email.
That's great. Yes. Yeah. Would you like the next question?
Yes, please, go for it.
Okay, so this is from Frank, and he has said, I have yet to ask an insurance company. I've yet have an insurance company ask for my ISO standards, maybe because I'm in the Middle East. In the future, should I give them the standard without being prompted? And also, Frank has asked if you know the accreditation body in the Middle East, in particular Oman.
So Ian, over to you with the insurance question first of all, whilst Tim's busy looking up who the Ucas equivalent is in the Middle East.
Yeah, so it could be a maturity of market thing. I don't know enough about the insurance market in Oman. I know a bit about that in the Emirates, but I don't know enough about Oman and how it operates as to how it is. But if I go back sort of maybe even 15 years in the UK, insurers might have asked some of the questions surrounding risk management that they might have asked some questions about how businesses are run that may well have had some relevance to standards, but insurers 15 years ago in the UK probably wouldn't have asked about standards, and certainly insurance brokers probably wouldn't have asked their clients for that information. And as we've market, particularly in the last sort of 5 years or so, the insurance, or 3 or 4 years, the insurance market's been quite difficult. Prices and premiums have increased, and it's become harder to get competitive cover at a good price. And part of getting a good deal, as it were, is to maximise the good features of whatever your risk is. And one of those things might be standards. So we, as an insurance broker, and it's not just standards, I should say, it could be any kind of information beyond, any kind of information that will set business A apart from business B is one that is worth insuring, will be helpful. And we, as an insurance broker, will ask that information. And it could be that if the insurance market in that particular, in Oman or wherever else, is not as mature, so the insurers are not aware of the standards, not going to make any difference, then they're not going to ask for it. All that being said, I would always volunteer. So in general terms, particularly if you're dealing with an insurance broker, the more information you can give them. It's a bit like, not that I've ever been in this situation, but if you're ever got a something criminal hanging over you, the lawyer, you've got to tell your lawyer everything, including whether you did it or not. And the same would apply to insurance, that if you've got an insurance broker, you tell them everything, and let the insurance broker decide what's relevant and what's not, and what's the best way of approaching the risk with insurers. Hopefully that answers Frank's question.
And Tim, have you been able to find out the accreditation?
Yeah, indeed, there is an Oman equivalent of Ucas, as you'd expect, and there are a number of, I was going to say Oman accreditation certification bodies. Actually, there are a number in the Gulf, covering off many of the Arab states around there. And of course, like NQA, there are some global certification bodies as well, who have representation in many countries around the world, particularly in the Middle East as well. So the answer is yes, there's a plethora of them.
Fantastic. Holly, how are we doing for questions? Anything else?
That's all the questions we have for now.
Okay, so we were talking just before we came onto this call around regulators. We're talking specifically in the UK around data breaches, ICOs. And I think, Tim, one of the questions that I get asked quite frequently as well is, would a regulator consider, would a regulator take into consideration the existence of an ISO standard if there was an incident? And actually it kind of applies to both of you, whether that be the ICO, whether it be the health and safety executive. What's their reaction to certification? Have you got any experience in this space?
Well, very much so. Elizabeth Denham, the previous Information Commissioner, is on record of saying that the ICO would take into consideration any relevant certification should an organization be subject to an information a privacy breach. Now initially that would have been ISO 27001 information security, because I'm sure you all know that technical organizational control is an important part of privacy, therefore information security, but also ISO 27701, which is the privacy information management system as well. So that's certainly the case for privacy. And the point being as well, in general, that if you've implemented a management system and you're certified to it, you are operating all of your processes, your controls or whatever in that continuous improvement cycle. And therefore you're in a strong position in the first place to prevent something going wrong, as opposed to not having done anything at all. In general, yes, it is looked on very favourably in those circumstances.
Okay. Ian, any views from your perspective, from an insurer's perspective?
Yeah, just to say that again, going back to this and I don't have any evidence for this, but anecdotally, my experience is that people who have ISO standards, and in fact, just not necessarily 45001 health and safety, but just any kind of standards, that they tend to have fewer claims. And I would suggest that the very fact of if you run through a management standard of any kind, and you get to the point of being certified and accredited to that standard, it will pick up things that you perhaps would not have known about had you not gone through that process. And as a result, I think that's probably why there are fewer claims, because people will find things and will realize that, oh, we should be doing this. And as a simple, Tim mentioned earlier about the risk. I've forgotten which one it was, 30 something thousand, I'm going to say, but that's a good example of, as you go through that process, you're going to identify things, and as you assess your risk and then do whatever you need to do. Perhaps there was an incident that might have occurred, and if you hadn't done that process, you would not have known about that, and so that incident that would have occurred doesn't in fact occur, and you don't get the claim. So it has this, and we're never going to know. There's probably, I'm sure there's some assessment that could be done on comparables businesses and so on that are regulated or not, but I would suggest that there probably is some correlation there. And then in addition to that, if you've, again, this is from my own experience as an insurance broker, and I've had clients who've had liability claims for employees getting injured or the public or whatever. In my experience, where there's some kind of accreditation, or they've got ISO standards and so on, it's just easier for everyone involved, the insurer, the broker, and the client, to get through that experience because of the systems that are already in place from the accreditation, from the ISO standard, whatever it is. So, and that could be, for example, company that has no processes or very little processes. Someone has an accident in a car, for example. There's no process, there's no procedure. No one knows how to handle it. No one keeps any of the information. There's no system in place, there's no process, and it's very difficult. Whereas in the alternative scenario, where someone has a 9001, say, there's a whole process to fill in forms. We have all the details. It's very easy. It's all accessible, and it's there straight away. And that then helps the process move in a more efficient way.
So it's almost it's a hidden benefit, isn't it? I guess it's a benefit that's almost unquantifiable in terms of you've had something go wrong, but actually fixing something that's gone wrong or responding to something that's gone wrong is a lot smoother, a lot easier, because you've got that standard in place.
Right, and I would always say prevention is much better than cure in terms of risk. and I'm sure we're all singing from the same hymn sheet on that. And the more that you can avoid an incident or incidents, the better.
So from an insurer due diligence perspective then, what type of evidence are you looking to see? Is it just the certificate, or would an insurer ever come out and audit the company? What's the stance from an insurance perspective?
So generally insurers will take our word for it as the broker. So if I'm approaching an insurer, a potential insurer for one of my clients to provide some cover, some liability cover of some kind, for example, we as the broker will produce a presentation that has all the information that the insurers need. Now there's a whole other aspect on the information that you need to provide, and the duty of disclosure that the people have, and I'm not going to get into that because that's a whole other webinar. But in very simple terms, it's our job as the broker to provide the required standard of information to the insurers to allow them to underwrite that risk. And generally they will take our word for it. So if the client says to us, we've got ISO 9001, we'll put that on our form, and the insurer will just accept that. What then sometimes happens, or well, quite often happens, is that every so often an insurer will do what they call a survey, and they'll send out a person. It might be someone who works for the insurance company, or it might be someone from a third-party body. But they will come out and they will go through all the details of that business, and that survey they often will, if the client has said, well, we've got ISO 9001, for example, the surveyor often will say, let's see what you've done, what improvements you've made, and that all sort of ties as part of the overall bigger picture of what type of business is this, and that's what those surveys are about, amongst other things.
Okay, and Tim, the other one that we see as well when we're working with clients is suppliers that want to come out, clients that wanted to come out and do a second party audit of a client. What's your view on people that want to come out and audit, and how would actually having an ISO certification potentially reduce those requests for clients to come and audit their suppliers? And are there any scenarios when you go, no, you don't need to come and audit me, Mr. Client, we're fine, thank you?
Well, indeed, yes, I was going to start with that. And then by way of an example, as I said earlier, many organizations now embracing the cloud. And they're in a supply chain, and their customers want assurance that their information is being managed appropriately, but actually it's all being looked after by Amazon or Microsoft. Yeah. So what we would normally say is, well, how do you know that your supplier is operating appropriate security controls? And you say, well, they've got the 27001 certificate. Well, that's great. But actually, does the scope apply to the services they're providing to you? If it's not a relevant scope, then the certification itself isn't relevant. So the important thing to note there is, if someone is let's call it certified, find out what the scope of that certification is and confirm that it's relevant to the services you consume from that supplier. And if they are, then ISO, or a certification body, I should say, have already been in and audited that supplier. Would you need to go in again, bearing in mind that that supplier is audited every year? I would say no, you don't need to go in if you have sought that and obtained that assurance that it's all appropriate to those services you provide.
I think that's absolutely brilliant advice, and definitely on the scope, that's crucial and really, really important. And people, if you take one thing away from this, that's a really single brilliant bit of advice there from Tim. And just to add slightly to it, on the information side, obviously the rules are now that if you have the data, and whether you've passed it to Amazon or Azure or whoever it is, or AWS or whoever it is, it's still your fault if something happens to it. And I think there's still a lot of people who still think, oh, my stuff's in the cloud, if something goes wrong, it's Amazon's problem, not mine. Well, it very much is your problem, and the ICO will see it as your problem too. And that's why that is such a crucial, important bit of advice, because if you're relying on any third party, you need to make sure that they're up to scratch.
Completely agree. And I know one of my frustrations, and I'm sure you both have seen this, is that when you receive a supplier questionnaire that asks you whether you've got ISO, whatever, typically 9, 14, 20, and then asks you all the questions that actually the certification covers. That's one of my pet bugbears. The other thing we've seen as well, Tim, a couple of times, and I'm very happy to share how we've helped a client respond, is when they've been asked for copies of network diagrams by their clients. Don't know whether you ever come across that. My view is if you're asked by a client to share a copy of a network diagram, the answer is no. No, because that's just providing a risk, exposing a risk, I think. But what's your view?
I would agree. An organisation would never normally reveal the internal workings of its information infrastructure and its security infrastructure to a third party. You can have NDAs in place and so on, but actually, if you've got an appropriate ISO certification in place, that question is being answered. They don't need to know, just treat you as a black box, as a function. Stuff comes in, is transformed, and it comes out back to the customer. And it's happening within an ISO, one or more ISO certified processes. That should be good enough.
So they're hugely powerful, aren't they? And I think as companies, we need to make sure that we maximise the benefits. We absolutely shout about the fact that a huge amount of effort and investment has gone into achieving an ISO. It can take many, many months to achieve ISO certification. It's not something that's tick box. It's not something that's self-assessment. You do need to get into the real weeds of an organisation to understand how it functions and to implement it correctly. But for me, I've always seen huge benefits in achieving those certifications. And I guess, Tim, Ian, would that be your view as well? Just go and do them.
Yeah, very much so. I speak to many clients who need the certification to win business, as you said earlier, to start entering into the market, and then they see the benefits of having done it. But it does require that effort up in the first place. Again, it comes back to that top management, giving that leadership, making sure resources are in place to achieve it and then maintain it. And it comes back to an earlier point as well. One of the benefits of it as well is that organizations become more efficient in terms of reducing cost, because they're identifying things that aren't operating as efficiently as they could do. They're checking them and they're acting on those and implementing those improvements. So it is a virtuous circle.
Ian, your views?
Yeah, I would just, again, reiterate what we said at the outset, which is that in my experience, those businesses that have ISO certifications are invariably better than those who don't. And that's across all vectors, not just the specific thing that they've been accredited on.
Okay, thank you. One more question, then I'm going to hand back to Holly to just see whether we've got any further questions and then wrap up. If you have to implement one standard, which standard would you implement and why? So Ian, over to you first of all. And Tim, I think you're slightly biased in this one, but Ian, over to you.
Well, do you know, I feel like this is a bit like first dates where they ask the person who wants to go first, because I probably would say, and I'm conscious that Tim's going to answer next, so I probably would say this is not influenced at all by what I know Tim's going to say, but I would say 27001. And the reason I would say that is because just right now at the minute, this is a very specific time and circumstance related bit of advice. Right now at this minute, by some distance, the most difficult and challenging part of the insurance market is cyber and data risk insurance, and that's because ransomware is a real issue. Allianz, a major big multinational insurer, released their sort of annual State of the Nation thing recently, a couple of days ago, and in pretty much every territory that they're in, cyber and data risk and ransomware was #1 concern of businesses in pretty much everywhere, other than Russia, interestingly. But yeah, it is a real issue. Ransomware, I've seen cyber claims, the frequency of claims is exponentially increased. The cost of those claims is exponentially increased. If you go back 2 or 3 years ago, the average cost of a cyber incident was sort of maybe 5 figures, sometimes 6 figures if you were unlucky. Now the average cost is almost £1 million. It's gone through the roof. And so just because the corresponding effect in the insurance world is that cyber insurance is already starting to get more expensive, and it will get more and more expensive still. I expect that by the end of the year, we could be looking at double, triple, maybe even 4 times the premiums that we're at the minute. Insurers are becoming much more restrictive in the types of business that they will cover and the protections that they look for. And so for all of those reasons, because it's such a huge exposure to businesses, I would say 27001 is probably the one right now to do. Tim, over to you.
You would think I would say 27001, but actually I'm going to cop out here, because having spent a lot of time working in privacy, and particularly with lawyers, the answer is always, well, it depends. And in this case, I would say it depends where you see your risks lie. I think and the kind of business you're in. That said, we are very much an information society services country, where processing of information is at the heart of every organization. So probably 27001, but I would encourage organizations to look at where their risks lie and pick the appropriate standard.
Yeah, that was a really unfair question, because I must admit I'd be sitting very firmly on the fence between 9001 because it is kind of the overarching standard. I think it helps so many businesses just understand where their risks are, and we see that being used as a springboard to then adopt other standards as well, or even to do two standards at the same time, in which case I'd have to go 9 and 27001 at the same time. But yeah, unfair question, guys, but I had to ask it. Holly, back to you.
We've had a question from Jason, who has asked, what is the best way to check a supplier's ISO certification to be sure they hold what they say they hold?
Tim, can I push that one to you?
Sure, yeah. Well, get them to send the certificate to you, and then main certification bodies or even accreditation bodies should present an online way of verifying that certificate. Each certificate will typically have some form of serial number or identifier on it as well, so you can determine the veracity of that certificate. But I would go back to the point about the scope, though. The certificate should have a scope statement on it. Check that, again, that it covers what you're doing. If it's a 27001 certificate, it may also have something called a statement of applicability. You can, many organizations offer that up, and in that you can determine which security controls have been implemented or have been omitted, which again can give you a warm feeling.
Thank you.
Okay, and then yeah, other than that, we've not had any other questions, but we've just had a few thank you comments. So Frank has said, excellent webinar delivered by knowledgeable panelists. Thank you for the information exchange. And Jason has also said, thank you all for an engaging and interesting hour.
Thank you. Thank you, Holly. And just on the last slide of that pack as well that we've sent through to you, there's details of some webinars that we've got coming up with RRSM, Holly, haven't we? Some courses that we've got coming up all on this topic as well. And I'll just quickly signpost as well to a webinar that Tim and I are doing on the, I should know this, 28th, I think it is, Tim, is it? All around what to expect from your auditor as well when it comes to ISO certification. And that's with in conjunction with the NQA. So Holly, thank you very much.
No worries, and just to reiterate what Helen mentioned earlier, you can download the slide pack from the handout section on the right hand side toolbar, and that contains links and to relevant webinars and training that's coming up, and also the contact details for our panelists today too. And in addition, the recording will put on the RRSM YouTube channel within the next 24 hours or so. So yeah, with that, Helen, Tim, Ian, thank you so much for an insightful session today. We'll leave it there. Thank you everyone for joining, and goodbye.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Ian. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Bye.